Our theme for Sunday Talks this month is Outwitting the Myth of the Devil. And today's topic is squatters or pioneers. This whole thing is a very different experience for me to talk about the devil or evil, because as I told you last week, neither of those words hang out in my vocabulary anymore. In fact, they're not the truth of my being anymore, and they're not the truth of your being either. But they are in the fabric of some religions, and they are in the fabric of individuals and cultures from a collective cultural consciousness of people who look for reasons outside themselves to explain bad things, bad in quotes, to explain mean actions, mean in quotes, for painful and cruel occurrences, all in quotes, or immature behavior. So last week I talked about how this comes about and comes around in the collective consciousness and is referred to as duality in metaphysical studies. If you missed that talk last week, though, as a prelude to this one, you can find that one on YouTube, so you can catch up, if you will, from the basis of this whole month's series. And this is something that none of us has inherently within us, and by that I mean this devil concept and the need to acknowledge it, live with it, outwit it, or deny it. Rather, we are the recipients of ideas and behaviors from the past, which developed years ago, maybe even centuries ago, in another time and place. And though our history is important for reflection and for learning, very few of us still practice most of the behaviors from those times. There's a cute little commercial on TV that shows a family living in the midst of today's world of conveniences and electronic wonders, but they have none of them. Why? Because they're squatters, by their own definition. So now you know the first half of that title, squatters. When we look around at the inventions, the conveniences, the wealth of knowledge, and its advantages to us in the world today, we realize how fortunate, and some would even say blessed, that we are to be living here and now. Yet in the beliefs of many, there is still a sense of separation, of apartness, fear, if you will, of what Napoleon Hill calls the other self, what Michael Beckwith and others have called the authentic self, and what Ernest Holmes calls the unity of good. So what is it within us that gravitates to the many improvements, ideas, and conveniences now available to us, and yet clings to old, even ancient ideas of our intrinsic value and worth? Thoughts like an unseen, sinister force that tempts us, threatens us, and sometimes consumes us. Well, in the words of Meryl Streep, in the movie of the same name, it's complicated. In fact, movies, TV shows, books, and other kinds of outside entertainment available to us from those very conveniences which are created for our pleasure and ease also bombard us with those negative, scary, and threatening beliefs. Have you ever thought about it that way? It's like push me, pull you kind of scenario. So even as we work to improve our belief systems expand our attraction and expression of the good, the loving, and the peaceful, seemingly we're still surrounded by the reverse. And I say we with tongue-in-cheek because I know there are vast numbers of people like you and me who know this and have chosen to move past it by replacing the negative in our words, in our thoughts, and in our actions, replacing the negative with the positive. Holmes calls it freedom from bondage. He describes it like this: there is great demand in the world today for a sense of security, of freedom, of liberty. But we must be very certain that in the experiential stages of testing our freedom and our liberty, we don't swap one image of bondage for another. He then goes on to explain that this can and does show up in philosophies, in governments, and yes, you guessed it, in religions. He suggests that it's challenging for the human mind to conceive liberty without licensing it, to practice freedom without egotism, to demonstrate freedom by understanding that liberty is the recognition of that unity of good. So I'm going to digress for just a moment from these evolved realizations I just listed to some ways of thinking that have yet to evolve. In David Hawkins' book, Power versus Force, and you've heard me refer to this time and time again. So if you haven't read it by now, that's up to you. I continue to refer to it because I consider it probably the signature book of metaphysics for the 20th century. It's just that incredible in its insights. In any event, in the book, he refers to negative levels of consciousness as destructive to life in both the individual and to society at large. And he identifies these negative levels of consciousness as shame, guilt, apathy, grief, desire, pride, anger. And really to better understand how he defines these words, because he has more than one meaning for them, one can read the chapter in this book titled Levels of Consciousness. For example, when he talks about desires, he's talking about destructive desires like addiction and obsession, things of that nature. So it serves you to really read how he defines these negative levels of consciousness. Returning to the concepts of liberty without licensing it, to practice freedom without egotism, and to demonstrate freedom by understanding that liberty is the recognition of that unity of good, Hawkins identifies his higher and highest levels of consciousness by such words as willingness, acceptance, love, joy, peace, enlightenment. Familiar words to practicing religious scientists. These, Hawkins says, are the teachings which uplift humanity and raise the levels of awareness of all humankind. So you see, he's looked at the spectrum. He's identified it, he's measured it, he's seen its feedback in the lives of literally millions of people over about a 30-year period. And as a result, has provided some guideposts for us. Not to berate ourselves, but rather to recognize what's in the outer consciousness, to be aware of it, not to camp out in it. So that's why I've used the title Outwitting the Myth of the Devil this month. Because the very fact that you're here, listening to this talk today, is the indication that you choose that too. You've gravitated to this time and this place, knowing consciously or unconsciously that the myth of the devil is no longer your myth. That contained within you is a realization that the creative energy, which you choose to call God, divine intelligence, or simply source of being, whatever you call it, is creative, not destructive. And that the idea of destructive is a level of consciousness not yet evolved to comprehend it or to comprehend unity. Knowing that, then, is knowing that you have evolved to a stage of comprehending unity, that awakened within you is a consciousness of greater possibilities and a driving desire to know more. Ralph Waldo Emerson once stated, "The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions." You've already been stretched by a new idea, because you've already recognized the dichotomy of good and evil, or God and devil, or construction or destruction. Able to recognize, identify, and discern those levels. And that's why we're here now. Unlike the squatters in that commercial I talked about, who are still doing what they've always done, there are millions of us today, here on planet Earth, doing the next thing, taking the next step, stretching for the next new idea, joining the pioneers in discovery. So it's not about hanging out or squatting with the devil anymore. It's not even about granting it any of our valuable time while we're here anymore. Knowing that our life journey is an eternal one, and that we take it in concert with so much more. Take time only to recognize that separation, hatred, limitation, negativity, and harm to others is not your call. Your call is for your highest and best good, which is a consciousness of unity for the highest and best good of all. And so it is.